Welcome to VSOW. Today we're launching into a really deep dive, looking back at an event that was so much more than just music. It became, well, a singular marker in modern history. Live Aid, we're talking about July 13th, 1985, that incredible 16-hour bicontinental spectacle. It really showed the world what rock and roll could do in terms of mobilization.
Exactly. And that mobilization, that's really our mission today. We've got quite a stack of sources here, historical essays, critical retrospectives, especially with the anniversary in mind, and some pretty complex analyses. We really need to pull out the critical facts. We want to understand not just the sheer scale of it, the iconic performances we all remember, but also the immediate numbers, the fundraising triumph, and maybe more importantly, the really challenging political and ethical questions about, well, how effective was it? What's its complex legacy? These are debates still happening almost 40 years later. It was absolutely a day of global unity. You couldn't deny that. But yeah, it left behind a complicated footprint.
Okay, let's definitely unpack this, because to really get a grip on the scale of Live Aid, we actually have to start smaller. It wasn't about Wembley or JFK stadiums right at the beginning. It started with a single piece of, frankly, harrowing news footage.
That's exactly the starting point. The real catalyst was this devastating BBC News report broadcast back in October 1984. That footage gave the West this really unflinching look at the famine that was just ravaging Ethiopia. Seeing that was what spurred Bob Geldof, then the frontman of the Boomtown Rats, to shift gears, really, from rock star to activist. And he immediately teamed up with Midge Ure from Ultravox, and together they wrote, "Do They Know It's Christmas?"
Yeah, and the sources really back that up. The way celebrities got behind that single, it was immediate, it was extraordinary. They managed to convince all these major British music figures to jump in, forming Band-Aids. And when it came out just before Christmas '84, it just exploded, became a huge cultural moment.
Oh, it wasn't just a hit song. It smashed records, became the fastest-selling single ever in British history at that point, and it instantly raised over £8 million for this new Band-Aid trust. That success right there, it proved that celebrity status could be, well, pretty rapidly converted into humanitarian cash.
And once they had that template working in the UK, the whole phenomenon, it just jumped across the Atlantic pretty quickly, didn't it?
Yeah.
The U.S. music industry saw the momentum, and they responded with their own kind of celebrity mobilization.
They did indeed. The U.S. version, We Are the World, came out in March 1985, written by Lionel Richie and Michael Jackson, of course, and it pulled together this just astonishing group of American stars. USA for Africa, they called themselves. The sheer star power in both projects, everyone from Boy George and Sting in the UK to Bruce Springsteen and Diana Ross in the U.S., that really set the stage for the next truly massive, audacious idea, Live Aid itself, synchronizing two huge live concerts on different continents.
When you think about the tech they had back in the mid-'80s, pulling off a simultaneous 16-hour live broadcast from Wembley in London and JFK Stadium in Philadelphia, that's genuinely staggering logistically. How on earth did they convince the biggest acts on the planet to sign up for something so unprecedented?
Right, and that's where Bob Geldof's role really shifted again. He wasn't just the passionate songwriter anymore. He became this high-pressure, totally relentless event organizer. The sources really emphasize that getting that lineup locked down, it took some extraordinary tactics. It wasn't just charm, apparently. It was this calculated mix of sheer determination and, well, multiple sources actually use words like bluff or even trickery.
Okay, give us a bit more flavor of that, this high-stakes persuasion game. What did that bluff actually look like?
Well, it sounds like it was a kind of musical brinkmanship. Geldof was basically running this high-stakes game where the currency was like scarcity and moral pressure. Reportedly, he'd call up a major artist who was maybe on the fence, say, I don't know, The Who maybe, and he'd claim that some massive rival, perhaps Elton John or David Bowie had already committed, often using the prestige of whoever he'd supposedly booked to really turn the screws. That fear of missing out, FOMO, on this historic, morally important moment, that was a really powerful motivator.
Wow. So he essentially conjured the reality by just claiming it was already happening, forcing these huge names to commit because they thought their peers were already in. That's quite an insight into, well, the role ego can play, even in a humanitarian push.
Precisely. And look at the result. A schedule just packed with music legends, which led to, well, monumental attendance figures. You had roughly 72,000 people crammed into Wembley, nearly 100,000 at JFK Stadium in Philly. But, as impressive as those live crowds were, they were completely dwarfed by the global reach of the broadcast.
And that's the absolute key factor, isn't it? the thing that cemented Live Aid's place in history.
Yeah.
The sheer scale of the TV broadcast it's almost hard to grasp today.
It was totally revolutionary for 1985. They broadcast the event using, well, advanced for the time, but still complex satellite links to 150 countries, reaching an estimated global audience of 1.9 billion people. Just think about that. That was a moment of synchronized, collective, global attention that, frankly, is just unattainable now in our hyper-fragmented media world. Back in '85, tuning into Live Aid, it kind of felt like one of the few things almost everyone on the planet was doing at the exact same time.
And all that incredible collective focus, it translated immediately, dramatically into financial success. Those initial fundraising goals were what just shattered almost instantly.
Oh, completely exceeded, dramatically. I mean, sure, the tickets and sponsorships brought in good money, but the real measure of success was that direct, emotional wave of donations during the broadcast itself. Live Aid raised a hugely impressive £40 million altogether in 1985. And when you adjust for inflation, the sources estimate that's equivalent to roughly £117 million today.
But the real measure of that emotional drive, that urgency, is the sheer speed the money was coming in during the broadcast.
Absolutely. Sources detail this astonishing rate of donations. At the peak points, throughout that 16-hour show, records showed money was pouring in at something like £300 per second, which added up to an estimated $150 million raised directly just from the concert day donations alone. It just showed this immediate, overwhelming public desire to do something.
£300. Every single second. That momentum was tied directly to the stated purpose, wasn't it? The funds were mainly for immediate food aid for Ethiopians suffering in the famine, with a secondary goal of supporting longer-term development.
Right, that immediacy of action and that very clear metric of funds raised, that's what really defined how successful it felt right afterwards. But, achieving those huge logistical and financial numbers meant holding the world's attention for 16 straight hours. Which brings us neatly onto the entertainment, the moments that became, well, part of rock mythology.
That brings us perfectly to part two then, the defining cultural moments. And when we talk about bridging continents, defying logistics, we really have to start with the ultimate stuntman of the day, Phil Collins.
Yeah. Phil Collins became this living symbol of the whole transatlantic thing. He was, quite literally, almost in two places at once. He played his set at Wembley in the afternoon, did his bit with Sting as well, then, using the absolute fastest commercial flight available, then the supersonic Concorde, he raced across the Atlantic.
Just using the Concorde was a massive statement in itself, wasn't it? The total journey time, even with that speed, included getting to and from airports.
Yeah.
It must have been incredibly tight.
Oh, absolutely. The Concorde was symbolic, really, of the huge effort, the kind of high-tech muscle they needed to pull this whole thing off. It basically halved the transatlantic flight time. So he arrives in Philadelphia just in the nick of time, plays his own solo set, and then he gets behind the drum kit for one of the most anticipated but also famously disastrous musical moments of the day, the reunion of Led Zeppelin.
Ah, yes. His famous line to the Philly crowd, acknowledging his completely crazy day. It summed up the whole global vibe perfectly. I was in England this afternoon. Funny old world. Ain't it tit? Though, as you mentioned, the sources are pretty much universal in agreeing that the Led Zeppelin reunion set was, well, chaotic, under-rehearsed, apparently out of tune.
Yeah, reportedly a major source of embarrassment for Robert Plant later on. It really highlights the difference between the iconic idea of something happening at Live Aid and sometimes the messy reality of the performance itself.
True. But if Collins represented the logistical triumph, there's definitely a consensus among critics, fans, the sources, everyone really, about the definitive musical triumph of the day, Queen's 21-minute set at Wembley.
Oh, absolutely. It's still widely seen, even all these decades later, as one of the greatest live performances ever, period. There was a big industry poll in 2005 that actually voted it the greatest rock gig of all time, which is fascinating, really, considering how legendary it became, that Freddie Mercury was apparently quite hesitant initially.
He was. Why was that?
Well, Mercury reportedly worried that performing would be seen as making too much of a political statement, which is something he generally tried to avoid. Geldof apparently had to really lean on him, reportedly saying something like, "Listen, Fred, honestly, if there was ever a stage built for you, this is it."
And boy, did he deliver. It was just a masterclass in stadium command, wasn't it? The set list itself seemed perfectly engineered for maximum impact, designed to keep not just Wembley, but that whole global audience completely hooked.
Totally. They kicked off with that powerful bit of Bohemian Rhapsody, which immediately showed their class, then slid straight into Radio Gaga. And that moment, it's highlighted so often because you see the footage, the entire crowd, all 72,000 people, clapping in perfect, almost hypnotic sync with the beat. It was like this visual proof of global unity right there.
And then came that moment, the one often called the note heard around the world. Mercury's call and response during that short a cappella bit.
Ah, the A.
Yeah.
Yeah, that simple, totally mesmerizing exchange, it was pure theater. It felt like this direct, almost intimate conversation with a whole stadium, then by extension, a billion people watching worldwide. It was just an incredible demonstration of Mercury's control, his charisma. Few performers could ever hope to match that.
Geldof himself seemed to recognize it as the absolute peak of the day, didn't he?
He did, yeah. He stated pretty clearly that Queen was absolutely the best band of the day. He said, they understood the idea exactly, that it was a global jukebox. They just went and smashed one hit after another. And they closed out that perfect 21 minutes with, "We will rock you," and "We are the champions." Just cementing their status as stadium gods and undoubtedly giving their career a massive boost.
Beyond those huge musical moments, Live Aid was incredibly effective because it very strategically used media and technology, not just for entertainment, but for these really emotionally charged, direct appeals for money. Let's talk about that moment David Bowie set in London was deliberately interrupted.
Right, that interruption. It was a calculated piece of, well, dramatic activism, really,
Yeah.
and probably one of the single most effective fundraising tools they used all day. Midway through Bowie's performance, the broadcast just switched abruptly to this really sobering montage of footage showing starving Ethiopians. And the soundtrack they used was the Cars song Drive.
That choice of music, Drive, that was deliberate too, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Quite emotionally restrained, almost melancholic.
Yeah.
A really stark contrast to the high-energy rock that came right before it.
Exactly. It was designed to just maximize the emotional shock value. Sources noted that both stadiums, Wembley and Philly, reportedly just went dead silent during that montage. It was this incredibly forceful, unforgettable moment that pushed the harsh reality of the famine right into people's living rooms across the globe. It was absolutely designed to trigger that thought. We can't just go on thinking nothing's wrong, and crucially, to make people pick up the phone and donate right then.
That juxtaposition, it perfectly captures the dual mission, doesn't it? Use the massive draw of entertainment to get the audience, then leverage that attention to deliver the raw truth and spur immediate action.
Totally. And while that montage succeeded incredibly well, another planned technological stunt actually failed spectacularly. Which brings us back to the logistical limits of 1985, the attempted transatlantic duet.
Ugh, the famous near miss. Mick Jagger and David Bowie trying to perform Dancing in the Streets, synchronized, live, between Philadelphia and London. Why couldn't they actually pull it off?
Well, the challenge was just immense. I mean, yes, they had satellite feeds working, but getting real-time, low-latency synchronization for a live performance across the Atlantic in '85, virtually impossible. The time delay, the latency, that's just inherent in sending signals across the ocean via satellite back then. Even a tiny lag would have thrown the audio and video completely out of sync. It would have been unwatchable, a musical car crash.
So, the tech was good enough for broadcasting one way, essentially, but not for that kind of live, perfectly timed two-way interaction needed for a musical duet.
Exactly right. They had to just abandon the live attempt, and instead they broadcast that pre-recorded video, which itself became pretty iconic, of the two of them singing together, shot earlier. It's actually a great example of where the sheer ambition of Live Aid kind of outstripped the actual technical capabilities of the era.
Right. Now, beyond those huge headliner moments, Live Aid was also really important for cementing the status of newer or maybe emerging acts at the time. U2's performance is often brought up as a major turning point for them.
Oh, it was absolutely crucial for U2. They actually played a set that was notably shorter than many others, but Bono's interaction with the crowd, especially the spontaneous moment where he jumped down and pulled a young woman out of the audience during the song Bad, that really cemented their reputation. It showed they could handle that immense scale, that emotional weight of a global audience. It really launched them decisively into true arena superstardom.
And, really importantly, the inclusion of Run DMC gave a massive, high-profile crossover moment for hip-hop, a genre that back then was still seen by many in the global rock and pop mainstream as pretty niche.
Yeah, their appearance raised the profile of hip-hop hugely. It showed the genre belonged on the biggest musical stage in the world. It helped ensure Live Aid represented, a slightly broader slice of contemporary music than just classic rock acts. And the whole day, really, from Queen's rock perfection through to Run DMC's urban energy, it all culminated eventually with Paul McCartney closing the Wembley show with a very fitting rendition of Let It Be.
So Live Aid undeniably set this unprecedented high watermark for collective global entertainment, for philanthropy. But here's where our deep dive has to pivot into the necessary complexity. That very success, that scale, it became inextricably linked with the controversies and the critiques that started surfacing almost immediately afterwards. We really have to examine this legacy critically, starting with criticism aimed at the performers themselves.
Right. The first major point of criticism really centered on what got called the diversity divide. Despite the whole event being organized to help an African nation suffering from famine, there was immediate and actually quite enduring criticism about the noticeable lack of Black artists on the main bill, particularly at the American venue in Philadelphia.
That does seem like a pretty profound, almost ironic disconnect, given the focus of the aid. What did the organizers say about how they chose the talent?
Well, promoters, people like Bill Graham, they defended the process. They stated they approached every major Black artist on the Billboard 200 chart and R&B chart. And the sources do seem to confirm that some big names did decline. Notably, Michael Jackson and Prince were mentioned. However, that defense was kind of undercut by claims from other really prominent Black artists, like Dionne Warwick, for instance, who stated publicly that neither she nor many of her peers were actually ever invited in the first place.
So the optics, a largely white lineup raising money for a Black African crisis, that quickly led to significant backlash, didn't it?
It did, precisely. Midge R. reflected on this later. He noted they were lambasted afterwards for that lack of diversity. He admitted it really exposed the organizers to an immediate anti-colonial diatribe, as he put it. And while they did scramble to add some acts last minute, like Tina Turner and Patti LaBelle, that initial imbalance definitely cast a shadow on how universal the effort really felt.
And that leads us directly into what is probably the most significant, most robust criticism leveled against the whole Band-Aid and Live Aid movement, the accusation of white saviorism.
Yeah, this is a really important critique. It argues that the whole effort, regardless of how good the intentions were, fundamentally perpetuated these harmful, often highly oversimplified tropes about Africa, often framing the entire continent as just this single, helpless entity that was dependent on, well, paternalistic Western intervention.
And the source material points directly to the language used in the original song that started it all, "Do They Know It's Christmas?" as being central to this critique.
Indeed. Critics jumped on the, frankly, dehumanizing geographical generalization in the lyrics, describing Africa as if it were one single barren, featureless place instead of, a continent of diverse nations. The lyrics paint this picture where nothing ever grows, no rain or rivers flow. That kind of language just reinforced an image of passive victims just waiting to be rescued.
And we have sources arguing that this narrative actually created long-term damage to how the world perceives the continent.
That's really the core of the critical analysis here. Suzanne Franks pointed out that even the original 1984 news report that kicked everything off, it only featured the voices of a white reporter and a European aid worker. So right from the start, it established this white-centric narrative control over the crisis. And Mookie Makura argued really forcefully in a 2023 retrospective that while the intentions might have been nodal, the concert permanently damaged the global perception of the entire African continent because it solidified that simplistic image of a helpless region. A perception she contends is, sadly, still pervasive today.
So the argument essentially is that Live Aid, in its attempt to simplify the crisis to motivate mass action and fundraising, it sacrificed crucial nuance and inadvertently ended up reinforcing these colonial-era stereotypes.
That's the structural critique, yes. However, Geldof himself offered a very strong defense, focused purely on the moral imperative of taking immediate action. He largely dismissed the white savior label as a distraction. He challenged the whole premise, asking, are only Black people allowed to react to an African famine? He argued the event was organized simply to take necessary action against an immediate, catastrophic threat to human life.
His argument being that the urgency of saving lives had to override the optics of who was doing the saving. But the ethical controversy really escalates dramatically when we look at the serious allegations that came up later about the misallocation of those huge sums of money raised. This truly marred the legacy.
Yeah, this is possibly the most difficult part of this whole deep dive. These very serious claims surfaced just a year later in 1986, highlighted most forcefully by that Spin magazine expose, the one titled Live Aid, The Terrible Truth. The core allegation was that the aid money, the funds raised, were being misused and potentially even bolstering the military government of Lieutenant Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam in Ethiopia.
Okay, just for our listeners, we probably need a brief, impartial bit of context on the regime that was in power in Ethiopia at that specific time.
Sure, absolutely. Lieutenant Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam was the head of the Derg. This was a military junta that had seized power back in 1974. His regime was notorious for widespread political repression, extreme violence, including a period known as the Ethiopian Red Terror. So in the mid-1980s, you have a country ravaged by famine, yes, but that famine was massively exacerbated by ongoing civil war and the Mengistu regime's own disastrous policies, like forced collectivization. International aid was flowing into an extremely hostile and incredibly complex political environment.
And the specific claims about how Live Aid funds might have been misused are, well, they're truly chilling. They directly contradict the whole humanitarian purpose of the concert.
They are deeply disturbing claims. The Espine expose alleged that Mengistu's regime was actually using the food aid as a kind of strategic weapon. They supposedly used the relief supplies to lure starving people into government-controlled camps. And once there, these people were subjected to forced relocation programs, which was really a brutal attempt by the regime to break the power base of rebel groups in certain areas.
And even worse, the sources claim that the actual money raised by the West was potentially used to fund the regime's military campaigns.
That was the second, equally serious claim, that the Mengistu regime diverted Western aid funds, especially hard currency, and allegedly used that money to buy arms, specifically from the Soviets, to keep fighting the civil war against various rebel factions. Which means, if true, that a portion of the incredible generosity shown by the global public might have inadvertently subsidized a brutal dictatorship and its military goals.
Wow. That presents just an agonizing ethical dilemma, doesn't it? How do experts now try to reconcile the immediate, very visible good the aid did with these alleged structural abuses?
Well, the assessment is profoundly complex, and you see often contradictory views. Sources quote experts, people like Alex DeWall, who estimated that the aid generated by Live Aid probably did cut the famine death toll significantly, maybe by up to half, suggesting an immediate, undeniable life-saving impact. However, the very same analyses often add this grim caveat that the intervention, precisely because it failed to address or challenge those underlying structural political issues, may have contributed to as many deaths in the longer run due to the abuses it perhaps inadvertently facilitated.
So, saving lives right now, possibly at the cost of worsening political instability and violence later on, that's just a terrible calculus for any charity operation to face. Geldof's defense of his actions was essentially that of someone prioritizing action above all else, maybe above perfect ethics.
That was absolutely his stance. He knew the situation was incredibly murky. He famously stated something like he would shake hands with the devil on my left and on my right to get to the people we are meant to help. He seemed to view the political context as a kind of necessary evil that had to be navigated to achieve the primary goal, saving lives. He later defended the overall mission, stating the event was almost perfect in what it achieved, really focusing on the massive mobilization and the undeniable delivery of that initial aid. And that conviction, that drive, incidentally, earned him his knighthood in 1986.
Looking beyond that immediate intense controversy, Live Aid undeniably established this huge new template for celebrity activism, didn't it? It really changed how global philanthropy operated afterwards.
Oh, it absolutely set the paradigm. It proved musicians could leverage their fame into, well, potentially billions of dollars of immediate relief and, crucially, political attention. We saw immediate imitations like Farm Aid, which launched that very same year, 1985, followed by other similar high-profile events like the Human Rights Now tour, the concert for New York City after 9/11, all basically following that multi-artist benefit model pioneered by Live Aid.
And Geldof himself seemed to recognize the limitations of that original charity model, which led to the evolution of his own activism with the Live Aid concerts, 2 decades later in 2005.
Yes, and that shift is really critically important for understanding the legacy. Live Aid was fundamentally charity about immediate food aid. Live Aid, by contrast, was focused squarely on political pressure. Geldof organized those concerts specifically to pressure the G8 leaders, who were meeting then in Gleneagles, Scotland, to address structural global issues.
Right. What were the specific structural issues he was targeting with Live Aid, moving beyond just sending food?
He focused on two key pillars that directly impact the economic independence of African nations. Firstly, debt forgiveness, and secondly, fairer trade laws. The argument being, if nations are crippled by huge historical debts owed to the West, and at the same time they face massive trade barriers and tariffs preventing them from selling their goods fairly, then no amount of charitable aid can really foster genuine self-sufficiency. Live 8 was basically a recognition that achieving long-term structural reform needs political action, not just a momentary injection of cash.
That seems like a direct evolution then, born straight out of the fallout and the critiques of the 1985 concert. And understanding that pure charity isn't enough if the global systems themselves are, well, rigged against developing nations.
Precisely. However, despite that evolution, the question still hangs in the air. Could a concert on the monumental scale of the original Live Aid ever actually happen today? According to our sources, the consensus seems pretty complex, but leans towards probably not, largely due to cultural fragmentation and the risks of commercialization.
That challenge of replicating it today is fascinating. Back in '85, media was pretty centralized, wasn't it? You had MTV, you had radio. They were the main gatekeepers of music taste. If you were a music fan then, tuning into Live Aid was pretty much the only way you were going to see all those massive acts live all together at the same time. It was almost a forced convergence of attention.
Exactly. Whereas today, music fandom, well, it's splintered into infinite niches across dozens of different platforms. Our collective attention is just dispersed everywhere. A single linear broadcast event is extremely unlikely to capture 1.9 billion simultaneous viewers now. You can stream full concert documentaries whenever you want. That unique scarcity, that must-see feeling of the 1985 experience, it's just gone.
And then you have the commercial reality of putting on massive events today. The sheer scale makes it so susceptible to commercial exploitation, which could completely undermine the charitable purpose, couldn't it?
Indeed. And one source of modern skepticism about repeating it comes directly from the public. We saw comments and retrospectives pointing out that in today's environment, such a huge event would likely be instantly corrupted by profit motives. For example, the somewhat cynical but maybe realistic viewpoint was shared, Ticketmaster would ruin it. By absorbing profits through excessive fees, dynamic pricing, non-refundable tickets. The sheer risk of commercialization getting in the way seems too high now to maintain the kind of ethical purity the original event aimed for, however complex its execution was.
So that magic, that forced convergence of the biggest names in pop, rock, hip-hop, all on one stage for one cause, is largely gone, replaced by this hyper-commercialized, fragmented digital landscape.
It likely means the ability to mobilize money quickly is still there, perhaps even more so digitally. But the consensus on the message and achieving that required unified scale for true cultural disruption. That seems much harder now. Geldof himself noted this difficulty, even when he was criticizing the Live Earth concerts back in 2007. He suggested those later events maybe lacked a final goal. He recognized that maybe humanity's Achilles heel is often its hubris, suggesting we tend to quickly revert back to the same old after a crisis passes, failing to maintain that collective focus and urgency.
So wrapping this up, Live Aid stands today as this truly monumental moment of, yes, unparalleled global unity and cultural transcendence. An unforgettable music event, no question. It dramatically reshaped the careers of bands like Queen and U2, but its actual humanitarian success remains a profoundly complex and still fiercely debated topic.
That really is the core dichotomy, isn't it? Live Aid's lasting power might actually be in that realization that while celebrity can mobilize billions, maybe mostly in the short term, real structural change demands continuous critical engagement, far beyond just a single day that shook the world. And it leaves a vital question, really, for you, the listener. When we face these enormous global crises, how do we balance the immediate emotional power we get from large-scale fundraising events with the long-term, often messy, but absolutely essential work of political change and ethical oversight?
That's a crucial consideration indeed.
Yeah.
And just for something maybe for you to explore further on your own after this, definitely look up Queen's full iconic Live Aid set list online. It's readily available. Or perhaps delve a bit deeper into the socio-political context of Lieutenant Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam's regime in Ethiopia during the mid-'80s. It really helps understand the incredibly difficult ethical landscape that surrounded all the aid distribution back then.
And if you found this deep dive valuable, please do subscribe, like, and maybe leave us a comment. Let us know what other historical events or complex topics you'd like us to unpack next time.
Thank you for listening to VSOWN.